Welcome to the Giggle podcast. I'm your host, Sal Grover. This podcast exists for cancelled women to have a voice in an era when most media is ignoring us simply because we stand up for our own rights and know that there is a difference between males and females.
Okay, first thing I want to ask you is, what is your actual take on all of these men who are starting to speak up about women's rights in the world of trans women or women?
Are we talking about the liberal
Ricky Gervais, Matt Walsh,
okay, so my take on Matt Walsh and Ricky Gervais is going to be very, very different because because Matt Walsh is a theocratic, misogynist fascist, and Ricky Gervais is not. So I'm not going to put them in the same. I'm not going to put them in the same camp. I mean, this is a complicated issue which causes quite a lot of friction, let's say, within the GC community about this issue about whether the speech of patriarchal right-wing men is helpful to us or not, as opposed to the speech of men like Gervais or Bill Maher or whatever, who can't so easily be dismissed. I think that's a complicated issue. My take on it is that actually this is an intra-progressive conflict. Because the right wing already agree with us, insofar as they agree that women are women, right?
This is the thing when people say, "Oh, look, this right wing horrible person agrees with you," and it's like, yeah, because
they agree with us insofar as they agree that female people are women, right?
Yeah, exactly. Which is just absurd.
But like pretty much everyone who hasn't pickled their brains in trans ideology.
Exactly.
And the thing is, even people who have pickled their brains in trans ideology will frequently slip up and make it obvious that actually they know women are female too, because everyone knows that women are female.
Yes.
Which is why I refuse. I mean, obviously I've been involved in a lot of arguments in this debate. One of the arguments I have mostly avoided is like whether women are female, because I said this to Helen the other day. I'm not going to argue about this. I'm not going to argue about whether chairs are chairs and like water is wet and like the sky is blue.
Yes.
And I'm not going to sit there and they'll be like, oh, well, sometimes the sky is orange. I mean, yes, sometimes the sky is orange. That's correct.
One of the things, like with the human rights complaint against me and my company, is that I was told that this individual is legally and morally a female. And I'm like, just take out the legally a female thing, because I don't know what that means. But what the fuck does it mean to be morally a female?
Right, that has no meaning other than it's placing. I mean, this is the thing about the law, right? It's placing this thing about rights and positive rights and whether they actually impose duties on other people, right? That's one of the ways of framing what this conflict is about, because social recognition is a social property, right? So what's actually being demanded when you say our identities must be respected or we have a moral right to be women is that you're imposing a duty on other people to recognize people as women when we can perceive quite clearly that they're male. Right. And that's one way of understanding what the core of this conflict is. It's very interesting. During the debates on the Gender Recognition Act in 2004, this was one of the issues that was raised, that it was a form of lawmaking that was potentially going to impose duties on people to recognize things that were contrary to their perceptions or beliefs and would lead to a form of totalitarianism.
Well, because this is
precisely what has happened.
Exactly, because this is my thing, is when I say that this is an issue that affects everybody. Like, obviously, we come at it from a women's rights perspective, but this is being allowed to acknowledge what you see with your own eyes. And if you're not allowed to do that, you don't live in a free society.
Right. So, I mean, I think, and to come back to this issue about alignment with various different constituencies of people, there are lots and lots and lots of different motives for being opposed to this ideological movement, right? like you say, our objections, significant numbers of our objections, are coming from a feminist perspective and the effect that it has on women's rights and women's rights to political association and single-sex spaces and that kind of stuff, right? But there's also the issue of the effect it has on gay people, the effect that it has on, right? Then there's the effect that it has on gender non-conforming children. So there's some people who are aligned with those issues who are opposing the ideology. Then, as you say, there's also conservative people, right? And the fundamental political interpretation is very different. Like as we keep saying, there are basically three positions on the sex gender issue, right? The conservative position is significantly different from our position.
Yes.
And then on top of that, there's a whole civil liberties, totalitarianism, like the right of people to have freedom of belief, freedom of conscience, and also to speak their perception of reality as they experience it, right?
Yeah.
And that's the bit where, you know, there's kind of a lot of rightish libertarian men, for example, who are also opposed to this, and they're opposed to it on that basis, right? So, you know, there are not many things I agree with Jordan Peterson about, but I agree with him about coerced speech, for example.
Yeah.
And
I
don't think one of the things that's very concerning is that the certain portions of the left, who we might understand, whatever we want to call them, the social justice activist, wokeist portion of the left, have now contrived to construct a kind of discursive frame in which anyone that's opposed to coerced speech is right wing, right? And I'm just like, yeah, but the greatest text on like discursive totalitarianism written in our culture is 1984. And that book was written by a lifelong socialist, right? So the left also used to understand that authoritarianism and coerced speech are not in the interest, like you can't build a just society on the basis of authoritarianism and coerced speech.
No.
And you can't build anything on coercively mandated reality denial, and then everything gets twisted, right? And I would oppose this, even if we didn't have all the women's rights issues and blah, 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 blah. I would oppose this one purely on the basis of like, yeah, coercively mandated reality denial and forcing people to say things that are against their beliefs and against their fundamental perceptions. That's the bit that I really object to. Like that whole bit in 1984 about, the party had the power to make you deny what you could see with your own eyes. And there's something very, very, the progressive wokeist part of the left, I'm reluctant to call them the left, have made this very, very, very fundamental mistake about the relationship between power and reality. And they think that the ability of power to dictate reality is something positive. Like we can use the ability of power to dictate reality, that's tyranny. I don't care in what interests you are dictating reality to people. If you are coercively dictating reality to people, you are engaged in tyranny, and tyranny is not good. Like, I don't know what to tell you.
The stupid things you find yourself, like the things that you thought were so obvious that you find yourself saying on a daily basis in this, because as I said, I don't believe that there is a single person on the planet that genuinely believes that women have penises. I don't think they exist. I don't think that there are people that have kept this belief a secret for 20, 30, 40 years and finally been like, oh, well, now we can come out and say it.
Well, I mean, this was one of the brilliant things that Gervais said, right? It's like you go back 10 years, you won't find tweets saying women don't have penises because we didn't think we needed to say it.
Exactly. And my thing is, if you're going to say that now you can say it, well, then the fact that you feel it's good, you can say it now, proves that you have some power and you're not an oppressed minority.
Right.
The act of being able to say it, because if I was to grant you the like, just to say, okay, you've thought this forever, fine, so then why now are you saying it? Well, then you must feel safe in saying it.
Right. So there must be some shift in the social context that means that you are now allowed to express this previously repressed belief. Right. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think even more than that, I mean, I said this yesterday in something I was saying about Gervais's piece, right? Because a lot of the responses to Gervais were like predictably, oh, you're like punching down on like this terribly oppressed minority, blah, blah, blah.
I think what his genius was in the special is he predicted it all, because he's got a bit about punching down. It's the toddlers bit.
Yeah, which is actually brilliant. And I think, I mean, it demonstrates, the thing about the toddler thing kind of demonstrate, I mean, and he was saying, I mean, it's not like he can, all the way through, he was like, this is irony, right? And the purpose of it is to make commentary on discursive structures, right? I'm not making claims about it being good to punch disabled toddlers, right? And some people think some of the jokes was, I don't think any, I mean, I don't think he's sexist. I don't think he's racist. I don't think he hates anyone.
No.
There's a lot of commentary in relation to Afterlife, where people are like going, I don't understand how this person who is like so humane and compassionate and produce this beautiful piece of work could also do, and I'm like, could also do exactly the same. And it's like, it's the same person. It's the same person, and he's not doing anything different here.
I actually just recently watched all of Afterlife, and the character is just him essentially. And I'm sure there's a lot of people, religious people, who hate the show and find it incredibly offensive, because his atheism is a running theme throughout the whole thing.
Right, and through everything that he does, actually.
Everything. Even like with this particular special, one of his first jokes in it was about the farting at a dead baby's funeral. Right. And as I said, I'm like 8.5 months pregnant. That's the one joke in the whole show where I was like, oh God, I really just don't want to think about dead babies right now, because that would be my worst nightmare. Right. Well, I don't make that his problem. You know what I did? Right. Because I watched it a second time. I actually just fast forwarded through that, because I was just like, I just don't like this. I find fart jokes as funny as anyone. But in this particular context right now, in my hyper emotional state, didn't want to hear that joke. I fast forwarded it. Life goes on.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this saying this is my problem, right, is kind of fundamentally what one of the things that's at stake here, right? I mean, I think it's interesting that one of the things about, well, the kind of fundamental structure of the totalitarianism that we're dealing with, like we said, is like thinking that you have the right to dictate to other people how they speak, how they perceive, you know, what kind of political activity they get involved in. And there is that's the structure of domination, right? They're treating everyone as if they're just narcissistic resources that are there to just reflect back to them what they want to have reflected back. What they're not able to do is what they're not able to do is kind of go, okay, well, this is what we would like, but we understand that other people have needs, right? And maybe what we want is overstepping the mark of like, or overstepping the boundaries of other people's needs, other people's interests, right? It's quite an important part of psychological maturity to be able to kind of go, or to be able to try and assess whether what is happening around you is somebody doing something to you that reasonably they shouldn't do, like discriminating against you because of the color of your skin, or because of your sex, or because of your gender identity, like, you know, not giving you a job or whatever, what have you. And where the demands that you're making on other people are actually just to do with your own feelings, and you should kind of go, well, this is kind of my problem. I want to understand myself in this way, but I can understand that other people have reasons for needing to understand the world in other ways. This is the bit that's so upsetting to it's like, we're not trying to kill you, we don't hate you, we need to be able to interpret the world on the basis of sex, because that's what impacts us, right? Yes. That's what's salient to people who are oppressed on the basis of sex. What you're saying to us is that we're not allowed to interpret the world according to a perceivable material reality that has these profound effects on our lives because it doesn't suit you. So you want us to abandon our entire way of perceiving and understanding the world and our entire analysis of our own oppression that has like, you know, hundreds of years of history and like a massive amount of literature because it doesn't suit you. And like that is so fundamentally narcissistic that I literally can't process it.
It's also so, to me, so fundamentally male.
Well, no, exactly. It's just male entitlement. It's narcissistic male entitlement.
Today, there was, I don't know if you saw it on Twitter today, there was this tweet from this author, Kaz Cook. She's an Australian author who wrote,
I didn't see.
She wrote a book that was that sort of big here, I think like 20 years ago, something called Up the Duff. And it was, you know, all about like pregnancy and stuff like that. So just one of those writers, and like has done stuff with like girls like going through puberty and stuff, sort of a humorist type writer. So basically a woman who has built her career on women and our anatomy, who then today was, you know, it's completely obvious that trans women are women, apparently. But how this was her tweet. And then in her next breath, it was, and even women who have hysterectomies are still women. That was her comparison of it. So it was like, you know, trying to say that having a uterus is not the defining factor that makes you a woman. And it's like, cool. But what you've just done there, honey, is say that the trans men who are going to great lengths to be men by removing their uteruses are still women. So you're actually transphobic by their definition in your defense of this, because your only thought that you have in your head is this insisting that it's trans women that are women. There's never the thought that trans men are men.
No, because the entire thing is structured by power, by sex-based power. I mean, like the entire movement is a demonstration of precisely what it claims to deny, because none of this would be happening if this was only female people making claims to be male, right? The fact that this is happening is because there are male people who have significant amounts of power who want something that people who have much less power than them have, i.e., and in this case, it's like actually our existence, right? I mean, quite often I say this, in some ways, this is a straight up down fight between male desire and female existence. And it turns out that a lot of people think male desire should take priority over female people's existence.
Well, okay, that's a great segue to what I want to talk to you about, because this is a subject that I don't feel like I've hardly ever spoken about in my life, liberal feminism.
Aha.
Yeah, I know. Because so that's why when I like saw all of your essays and I was like, liberal feminist, yes, like, because it's not, I'll be so upfront about this. Up until a few years ago, I didn't even really know that was a thing.
Most of the feminism that is disseminated in public space,
yes,
as just feminism, is liberal feminism. Right?
Yes, but for me, I had always just thought that feminism was about females and making our life better, and so if it wasn't doing that, then what the hell is it? That it's not feminism, basically, if it doesn't center female.
This is what Andrea Dawkins calls like primitive feminism.
Yeah.
Right.
And so
if it's not good for women, we're against it.
Yes. And while I can sit there and argue about like sexual liberation and things like that to a point, I'm not completely opposed on things like that. But I'm against pornography. And I'm just at the point where I'm like, look, I'm so over like say like the overly hyped sexuality and sexualization of the music industry, for example, and all of this sort of stuff. What is this?
I mean, I don't think any of that is sexual liberation. I think that
no, I don't think that's my.
There's been a very extreme and major conflation between the sexual liberation of women and women performing patriarchal femininity for the male gaze, and they're not the same thing.
As I say this, like I have no problem with, like, for example, like a woman sleeping around. That is something that I've quite often, especially in my 20s, I really defended it. And I can go a bit the other way now. I think it's partly maybe getting older, experience of it. You come out of that. It's something that happens, I think, that starts happening to a lot of women. And I've talked to a lot of my friends about this. You start to get into your late 30s, and your interest in the male gaze starts to go away.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's been there for long enough. So even if you did court it for a little while, you're now like, okay, I'm done.
Right.
And so I can have like arguments like about that as well. But it's basically what the liberal feminists are basically the ones that we have to get on side, is my thing. Like, if we go even just before, we were talking about like the conservative men, at the end of the day, I don't give a fuck.
Right.
It's because we are not going on any other journeys together with that demographic. It is
I mean, and this is why I say it's principally an intra-progressive conflict,
Mm-hmm.
insofar as the political pressure that's pushing this thing through are from people who ostensibly, and prior to this conflict, we would have considered to be part of our general tribe, right?
Yeah. And I think that's the thing I resent the most, is this divide amongst women that has happened by men, because they have actually convinced some women to hate other women for not believing that men are women, in a nutshell. That I find that
right. And then they've also given a ton of ammunition to progressive identifying males who
Mm-hmm.
have been waiting for like the last fucking 40 years to have an excuse to shit on feminism.
Did you know, actually, just a really quick aside with that so for the last like 5 years, prior to 2020, I'd never tweeted before. I just used Twitter purely as something to read, and I followed, but the people I was in a totally progressive bubble. I had no idea this stuff was going on. And 90% of the male progressive journalists that I used to follow, whose opinions and commentary I totally respected, have actually blocked me on Twitter. Yeah.
No, I mean, progressive men, not all of them, obviously, caveats.
There's real progressive men, and then there's
significant numbers of lefty progressive men have never really been on board with feminism, right? And to a degree, they had to, at best, ignore us, or kind of mouth to some degree some, platitudes about respecting women's equality and blah, 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 blah. But feminism in its more radical forms, and I include in that both radical feminism and socialist feminism, and even like, actually, if you look at some of the founding documents of like NOW, for example, which is like a classic liberal feminist organization in the States, if you look at the 10 demands that they made in the 70s, they're for like, full reproductive control and proper maternity care and all of that kind of stuff. If you actually were to meet even those demands, you would have to, I mean, particularly in America, because actually the situation of women in America is probably worse than in any other like developed Western alleged democracy, because there's interesting reasons why that might be the case, right? But they have never really been on board with it, and the reason why they've never really been on board with it is because it messes with their sexual entitlement and their entitlement to women's labor and their entitlement to women's emotional labor and their expectations that women are going to bend the world around them in order to meet their needs. And allegedly progressive men are not significantly less entitled in relationship to women's bodies and women's labor than right-wing men are. Right-wing men are just much more obvious about it, right?
Which I kind of respect.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm at the
respect.
point.
I mean, at least they come out and say it,
This is my
right?
thing.
And at least you know these guys are not on your side.
Yeah, respect is a strong word, but I respect knowing exactly where I stand from the get-go.
Right. Whereas, you know, one of the things that, I mean, I agree with you about the women, right? And this is something that I agree with you we need to talk about. And I do think it has a lot to do with age, actually. I mean, Glosswitch has said some very interesting things about this that I think are really bang on, where, you know, the TRAs have this whole discourse about, like these old hags, they just need to die out, right? And then it was fine. And then we will inherit the earth and everyone will believe us, you know, and Glossy is like, you don't seem to understand, right? The reason why we don't believe you is because we've been female for long enough and had enough experiences to not buy your bullshit about how being female is irrelevant, right? And you might be able to convince a 20-year-old of that. And it's actually understandable. I mean, virtually all of us believed that when we were in our 20s, because you don't want to believe you're oppressed. You want to believe you can do exactly what you want. 100%. You want to believe that, like, that's how I was. I remember being like 18 or 19 years old and sitting on the bed with some dude I was chatting up at a party, being all like, oh, you know, feminism was so important and they did all these very important things, but we don't need that now. And, you know, I'm not, and being so pleased with myself because I'm just like, I'm so sophisticated, but also I'm not a threat to this dude. And like, you know,
and I'm so cool and switched on.
And I'm so cool and like switched on and edgy and like,
we've all been.
And obviously looking back now, I'm just like, no, you just like wanted to have sex with him. And you thought that if you told him, I mean, obviously I believed it, but I realize now that the courting, like the male gaze and male approval thing was very much at play in what I thought was this incredibly sophisticated, nuanced analysis of the history of women's rights. I was just like, no, you just didn't want to scare off this dude, right?
I mean, I think it's an important sort of rite of passage for a woman to go through, to see that you get no respect from being that way, zero. No. And it might take it's years.
You get no respect, and it's not true. That's the thing, right? I mean, I my 20s and early 30s, and I did a lot of this with my best friend. Actually, we did basically what you know, we did old-fashioned consciousness raising on the phone with each other for about a decade, right? Where we started being like, hang on a minute. I've noticed, you know, and we would precisely how consciousness raising used to function. What you do is you get a bunch of women together and you're like, there seems to be a pattern here. I wonder what could possibly explain this pattern. I wonder why our partners are not doing any of the domestic labor. I wonder why we've been thrown out of all of our friendship groups because we split up with the men, and now those friendship groups consist of the men with their new partners. When we thought that we were in this lovely egalitarian, you know, completely non-sex-based, hey, everyone's human kind of group, and then we're just like, no, all the women just got kicked out and replaced with other women, and the men are all still friends.
For the first, like my late teens, early 20s, I was quite like sort of how I lived my life, just unconsciously, really. I was quite blind to sort of issues because I was raised to be like that. I could do whatever I wanted. I was kind of raised by my dad to have the confidence of what we would now call, as some would say, like the cis white man, heterosexual white man. I was raised to think and act that way.
And I mean, this is a very complicated political question, right?
Yeah.
Because because the structure of the double bind is actually inherent in that problem, right? Yes. Because of course you want to raise women to tell them that they are full human subjects and that they can do whatever they want to do, and they like should not be limited by their sex. But the problem is when you raise women think that, they then go out into the world and start acting like that, and then they start banging into fucking walls, and men start being really aggressive and like dominated. The amount of shit I got from men in positions of authority over me,
yes,
whenever I would like, I mean, I didn't even have to challenge their authority. I just needed to speak in a manner that suggested I thought my ideas were like worthwhile and should be taken seriously. And they would get so fucking aggressive.
Same. So this is
I'd be like, why are they being so aggressive?
Yeah, this is what happens. So what I've said to my dad since so many times, I'm like, I love how you raised me. However, you did not tell me that no one else would see me that way. And so I got to Hollywood at 24 years old with the only life experience I had basically was being at university. I wanted to go and write movies. I had nothing but confidence and some kind of ability. I was just like, I'm just going to do it. And in hindsight, it only took like 12 months for me to get into the industry. It was very, very quick. I was very lucky. And then it turned, and it took a little while. I for a long time, I was like, oh God, am I just not good enough? What is happening? And then I realized, no, hang on a second.
Yeah.
It's my femaleness.
Right.
Because these male screenwriters, 90% of them are male screenwriters. Yeah, they're not getting sexually assaulted in these rooms.
Right.
I am though.
Right.
So like I had to acknowledge what because I thought like, is it because I have written about or been open about being sexually liberated? Am I being punished for this? Well, yes, I was.
Right.
Because men are allowed to walk into a room and announce that they are, but a woman's not.
Right. And that's the thing. It's like it's very complicated, and I don't know how I'm very interested in, coming out of this situation that we're in now in terms of like how we try and address ourselves to younger women, because that breaking of the genealogy between older women and younger women, which is very much kind of perpetuated by patriarchal ageism, right? And like, we're not going to turn into those dried up old hags. That's never going to happen to us, right? And don't listen to them. They're just nasty, spewing, hateful bigots, right? That separation of older women from younger women and making younger women discursive structures that stop younger women hearing what older women have to say is absolutely crucial to the because then you can keep feeding young women into the system, right?
Well,
and they haven't got any defenses, and there's not older women around them being like, you want to be a bit careful about that. And it's I hate this as well. Like when I see young girls walking around in like tiny sawn off like pants with their bums hanging out, right? And it's like, I wish you lived in a world in which it was actually safe for you to walk around wearing those pants, right? But it's not.